They said the papers were burned. They said the house was empty. But the handwriting matches. God help us if it's true. Welcome back. Before we continue, like, subscribe, share. The Verren estate stood 3 miles east of Port Claiborne, its foundations sinking inch by inch into the red clay bluff above the river. Travelers on the Natchez Trace sometimes reported seeing lamplight in its upper windows long after the family line had ended. The main house had collapsed in the 1890s, but in the spring of 1974, the county registrar authorized a controlled excavation after surveyors uncovered a cellar sealed behind 2 courses of brick. Inside, archivists discovered boxes wrapped in linen and marked only with the initials EV, dated 1834 to 1859. The find was initially classified as an ordinary antebellum family archive, ledgers, correspondence, household accounts. But closer study revealed something stranger. The pages were arranged like testimony. Margins were annotated in 2 distinct hands, one female, one male, sometimes addressing each other directly across time. Every few leaves, a phrase recurred in identical scripty: "The wager is made. The record must endure." At first, the Mississippi Department of Archives cataloged the material under Private Papers Verren Family. But one of the archivists, Dr. Inez Calloway, noted that the handwriting and formatting mirrored another sealed collection already in state custody, the so-called Bowling Draper Papers, long restricted until 1975. That resemblance prompted renewed interest, and within months rumors circulated through local universities that the Verren documents represented a missing link between 2 well-known 19th century scandals, the Magnolia Club wagers and a series of disputed inheritance suits that followed the war. The earliest document, dated April 3, 1834, is a letter written by Ephraim Verren, plantation owner and amateur naturalist, to his associate Judge Horace Bellwether of Adams County. The subject of our discussion, the purity of descent, has occupied my every waking thought. If the principles we debated in your library hold, then heredity may be observed and proved, not merely assumed. I intend, therefore, to conduct a limited experiment within my own household. For posterity's sake, these notes must remain private until such time as reason can prevail over sentiment. The tone is clinical detached, but the implications are revolting in retrospect. Ephraim's experiment referred to controlled breeding between enslaved laborers selected for physical similarity to members of his own family. He described it as a moral inquiry into the constancy of inherited form. Among the linen-wrapped papers, archivists found not only letters, but also anatomical sketches, charts of infant measurements, and what appeared to be crude genetic notations. Though the concept of heredity as we understand it did not yet exist, Ephraim had attempted to trace what he called recurring likeness, believing it a visible mark of divine hierarchy. By 1838, Ephraim's correspondence shifted from the language of science to the rhetoric of theology. His marginalia began to quote obscure sermons about the covenant of likeness and flesh unbound from its ordained place. A penciled note by his wife, Margaret Verren, found among the same pages, reads only, "If he persists, the house itself will rot from the inside. The children do not sleep, the walls whisper their own names." Margaret's letters are the first human voice in the archive. Hesitant, ashamed, terrified of what her husband had begun, she described collections he kept in the carriage house: hair, bone, plaster impressions of faces. She mentioned that their eldest son, Edwin, was forbidden from entering certain rooms after dusk. She also hinted that Ephraim had corresponded with other gentlemen of study, though no replies were found among his papers. When Ephraim died suddenly in 1841, local physicians attributed it to a stroke, but Margaret's diaries, found later bound within the same box, paints a different picture. She wrote of contortions and a sound like a child's cry echoing from his lungs. His death certificate was unsigned, and the attending physician's notes are missing from county records. Margaret attempted to destroy the papers but was stopped by the estate executor. her brother-in-law, Reverend Cyrus Veron, who claimed the documents were a work of instruction. He sealed them in the sub-cellar chapel and ordered the household never to speak of them again. For 30 years, the Veron family name faded from public notice. Yet, curiously, census documents show that the number of residents on the estate grew even after emancipation should have emptied its fields. There were no birth records, no marriages, no deaths filed for those years. Just the steady enumeration of house servants, increasing each decade. By the time the war ended, only one Veron remained, Dr. Lucien Veron, Ephraim's grandson, a physician trained in New Orleans. Lucien reopened the estate in 1867 as a private infirmary for conditions of lineage and mind. Surviving patient notes, found partially burned in a later box, suggest he was continuing Ephraim's research under a medical guise. He described several patients as exhibiting hereditary echoes, claiming to observe facial recurrence across unrelated stock. His notes adopt the same cold phrasing. Subject 4, female, features strongly recall EV generation I, suggesting preservation of primary pattern despite external admixture. In the margins, another hand, feminine, neat, probably a nurse's, had written, means they look like him. All of them look like him. When the archive was rediscovered in 1974, the boxes emitted a faint chemical odor. Preservation specialists identified residues consistent with 19th century embalming compounds. Several pages were fused by what appeared to be organic matter, skin oil, possibly blood. Radiocarbon tests later confirmed traces of human tissue within the fibers of certain bound notebooks. An internal memorandum from the archives dated June 12, 1974, state, "It is our recommendation that public discussion of the Veron collection be deferred until the 1975 unsealing of the Bowling-Draper materials to avoid premature speculation about cross-referenced content." The two archives appear connected by individuals active in the Magnolia Club between 1847 and 1858. Any mention of biological experiments should remain internal until verification is complete. Privately, several staff members resigned after handling the papers. One technician, interviewed months later, claimed that the ink had not yet dried. Another described hearing what she thought was a heartbeat when she pressed a page flat under glass. In September 1974, Dr. Calloway recorded her final field note before the collection was resealed for restoration. Her words end Part 1 of the Veron file. "I have now examined all 14 volumes, each arranged by year and marked with Ephraim's initials." The final book concludes with a single line dated November 14, 1858, the same date referenced in multiple Magnolia Club records. It reads, "They thought the wager concerned descent, but the true inheritance was silence. When I closed the ledger, the paper sighed. That is not metaphor. The sound was physical, expelled from within the binding. I am placing these materials back into quarantine until further instruction. I do not believe the experiment ended with Ephraim." The pattern continues. That was the last documented entry before the official unsealing scheduled for the following year. Dr. Calloway left her position soon after, citing health concerns. She refused all interviews and disappeared from public record in early 1975, a month before the Bowling-Draper files were opened to national attention. What remains is her typed inventory, and the Veron papers themselves. Ink, black, fragile, waiting. The wager is made. The record endures. When the Veron documents were resealed in October 1974, the plan had been simple. Hold them under controlled conditions until the following summer, when the 100-year restriction on the Bowling-Draper materials expired. But before the year ended, 2 new boxes arrived from a private donor who requested anonymity. Their label read only, "Recovered from Port Claiborne, attic of the East Wing." Inside were fragments of journals, loose photographs, and a series of brittle, smoke-stained sketches stamped Dr. L. Veron, M.D. 1872. The sketches, rendered with eerie precision, depicted anatomical cross-sections of the human head, each annotated with looping cursive phrases like, seat of memory, inherited impulse, and facial likeness beyond parentage. The last drawing showed two profiles, mirrored, one clearly male and the other a softened version of the same, labeled simply, a framed a subject 11. At first, the archivists assumed they were examples of 19th century physiognomic study. But on the reverse side of one sketch, a faint pencil notation read, "The chapel basement remains undisturbed. The bones confirm transmission. The faces repeat themselves." This marginal note matched the handwriting of Dr. Lucien Veron, the grandson physician whose name had appeared in Part 1. From his surviving correspondence, a darker picture began to take form. Lucien, it seemed, had continued his grandfather's work by recruiting patients from among freed laborers and the poor. Officially, his infirmary specialized in hereditary mental decline and degeneracies of the blood, fashionable pseudoscientific diagnoses of the Reconstruction era, but behind this pretext, Lucien was cultivating a collection of human specimens, people whom he claimed exhibited recurrence of family patterning. Despite having no relation to the Verons at all, his patient records list 42 individuals admitted between 1868 and 1876. Only 12 were ever discharged. The rest were marked, transferred. Though no receiving institution was named, the final pages of his logbook, discovered in the attic boxes, are mostly blank except for one trembling line dated November 14, 1876. Precisely 18 years after the date repeated throughout the earlier archive. All patterns return to origin. Local oral histories fill some of the missing context. In the 1930s, Works Progress Administration field workers interviewed elderly residents of Claiborne County. Several recalled stories of the Doctor House, where folk went in and didn't come out. One woman, born around 1850, described seeing faces in the upstairs glass that weren't the doctor's kin but wore his same expression. Another said her grandmother warned her never to drink from the wells near the old Veron land because the water remembered voices. These fragments of my funk were not for a set of photographs found among the newly donated papers. They were daguerreotypes, remarkably preserved, showing subjects seated against plain backdrops, eyes unfocused, mouths slack. Each plate bore the initials LV and a sequential number. When archivists compared them, they realized the impossible. Every image showed a different sitter, yet all shared identical bone structure. Modern forensic analysis confirmed that the same facial ratios repeated across at least 12 individuals. Same orbital distance, jaw angle, ear height, so exact it defied probability. In the 1974 restoration notes, one technician scrawled in the margin, if not manipulation, then replication. But how? Further investigation into Reverend Cyrus Veron revealed his role in preserving these materials. He'd been a circuit preacher during the late 1840s, and one of the few family members to survive the war. Church archives record a sermon he delivered in 1859 titled, "The Mark That Travels Through Blood." The transcript, published in a now rare pamphlet, includes this line, "As sin begets sin through generations, so too the visage of the guilty may find host in the unborn, seeking atonement or revenge in form repeated." The Cyrus had been writing about what Ephraim called recurrence. Only he cloaked it in scripture. To him, the repetition of faces was a punishment, a visible genealogy of guilt. Yet even he preserved the records, locking them beneath the chapel as if obedience to God required keeping the evidence safe. In her 1974 memo, Dr. Calloway observed, "The Veron archive blurs the line between documentation and confession. Every attempt to destroy the evidence seems driven not by denial but by fear of interruption, as though ceasing the record would invite something worse." A single surviving journal from Margaret Veron, Ephraim's wife, gives a rare glimpse into the family's interior life. She wrote sparingly, her handwriting tight and deliberate. One passage from 1840 reads, "He says likeness is proof of divine order. Yet when I look at the children, I see only strangers. Even our son Edwin has taken to sketching faces that are not his own. He says they come to him when he sleeps, faces that breathe, eyes that move beneath the paper. I burned his first drawing. The next morning it reappeared, smudged with ash, in the cradle of our youngest. Margaret's diary ends abruptly the following year. Her burial record lists fever, though local doctors noted she was found with her eyes open and tongue blackened, as from chemical ingestion. Edwin, her son, would later disappear from census records entirely, but a ledger entry under Dr. Lucian's name in 1869 lists a male subject, aged approximately 40, surname unknown, possessing familial features. In early 1975, as preparations began for the joint unsealing of the Bowling, Draper and Varon archives, rumors spread through academic circles that the two collections were linked not only by theme but by blood. One historian claimed that a Fairmont descendant had married into the Varon line in the 1820s, merging two of Mississippi's most powerful families. If true, the implications were enormous. The so-called Magnolia experiments may have originated as a private wager between these families decades before the infamous human stakes scandal of the 1850s. The archive's internal correspondence grew cautious, almost superstitious. Staff began refusing to handle the boxes after sunset. Temperature monitors registered unexplained fluctuations, as if the contents were generating heat. One night guard, a veteran named Hollis, reported hearing breathing near the quarantine vault. His incident report was filed, then quietly misplaced. On February 3, 1975, a small team led by Calloway's assistant, Professor Henry Lyle, was authorized to conduct a preliminary cataloging. His notes, later found among his personal effects, describe something that official reports omit. The Varon volumes, when laid side by side, form a continuous pattern of watermarking visible only under UV light, an interlocking design resembling a double helix. Each page is aligned as if intended for assembly into one extended sheet. This cannot be coincidence. The technology for such watermarking did not exist in the 1830s. Someone, perhaps Lucian, modified them later, or continued them. Lyle's team disbanded 2 weeks later. 2 members resigned immediately, citing unexplained migraines. Lyle himself left for Louisiana State University and never published his findings. Today, the Varon papers remain partly sealed, accessible only to researchers with written clearance. Of the 14 original volumes, 11 survive intact. 3 are missing, the ones corresponding to 1858, 1876, and 1899, the same years that mark the beginning, recurrence, and supposed end of the experiments. In her last surviving letter, written weeks before her disappearance, Dr. Calloway offered this reflection: the Varons tried to quantify sin, to measure it in bone and flesh. Instead, they replicated it. Every record is a contagion, each reading an act of continuation. If the pattern truly survives, it is not confined to bloodline. It travels through attention, through the eye that looks, the hand that copies, the voice that repeats. When the audio tape of her final dictation was played during the 1975 review hearing, witnesses reported a faint secondary voice layered beneath hers, slower, almost overlapping, repeating the same words half a second late, syllable for syllable. Analysis confirmed no editing anomalies. The archivist who logged the tape described it best: like a face forming in a mirror. One moment after your own. The record ends there. The wager endures. The matter is hereditary only insofar as the soul repeats its own architecture. Flesh remembers what conscience forgets. The deeper one examines the Varon records, the less they resemble medicine, and the more they resemble ritual. What began as a sequence of anatomical observations devolved into something unclassifiable, a merging of superstition and proto-science, bound by obsession with resemblance. Among the attic papers recovered in 1974, a single document stood out: a thick, stitched notebook labeled Book of Comparative Derivations, 1873-74. Its entries are divided between Latin notations and sketches of skulls, each accompanied by delicate pencil tracings of living faces. Margins are filled with looping annotations such as transmission through cranial proportion and symmetry as spirit's residue. The final entry, signed by Lucian himself, reads, "When tissue aligns to memory, the face is the proof." The line repeats, "The flesh confesses." Lucian's surviving correspondences to a colleague named Dr. Jonas Herrick's, possibly a pseudonym, reveal how far he had wandered from accepted practice. In a letter dated February 9, 1874, he wrote, "You have seen the recurrence yourself. How a widow bears the visage of her dead husband's mother, or how a pauper's child will mimic a magistrate's profile without kinship or contact. Blood is not lineage, it is a vessel that seeks the proper shape. I have begun to believe there are but a finite number of faces permitted to humanity. The rest are repetitions, echoes awaiting their hosts." A later letter, unsigned but in the same hand, continues the thought, "The Fairmont and Verin strains show only that heredity is a pattern in search of expression. If we learn its rhythm, we might compel the flesh to reproduce any form desired. In this, God's monopoly on creation could be broken." No record of Herrick's reply has ever surfaced. When Professor Henry Lyell revisited these notes in 1975, he was struck by the precision of Lucian's anatomical sketches, so detailed that, when scanned under spectral light, they revealed measurements corresponding to modern craniometric indices not developed until the 20th century. The implication was staggering. Either Lucian Verin had achieved a form of knowledge lost to history, or someone had amended his notes decades later with impossible accuracy. The comparative derivations ledger contained one more anomaly. Between two anatomical plates was pressed a fragment of thin, translucent parchment, later confirmed to be human epidermis, chemically treated to resist decay. Upon its surface, faint writing could be discerned in reversed script, as if written from the underside. When mirrored, the words formed a short invocation. "If the image perish, let it return in the next host." The line unbroken, the countenance preserved. In Lyell's commentary, found among his unpublished drafts, he remarked, "The Verins' heresy was not their science but their success. They sought not to defy death, but to perpetuate identity, to ensure that the human face, once formed, might never vanish from the world." An old man named Caleb Sutter, a caretaker on the Claiborne estate during the early 1900s, provided one of the last first-hand accounts of what the property had become. In an interview recorded in 1931, he recalled tending the overgrown gardens of what he called the doctor's hall. There were mirrors in every room. Sutter said, "Not the kind you buy, but built into the walls, like they grew there. I was told not to dust them, only to keep the glass clear. Sometimes, when the wind came through, I'd hear tapping, like fingernails from the inside." He also mentioned a sealed wing, padlocked from both sides, where a lamp burned day and night, though no one ever trimmed it. In that wing, he once glimpsed what he described as woman's shape moving behind the glass. Though when he entered, he found only a portrait of Margaret Verin, its varnish still wet after 60 years. The following week, Sutter resigned and moved north. His death certificate lists cardiac arrest. The coroner's note adds, "Heart failure accompanied by severe expression of fear." The Verin property was eventually sold to a lumber consortium in 1912. Records show that, when demolition crews attempted to dismantle the main house, their tools dulled inexplicably against certain walls, as if the plaster contained metal. Underneath layers of paint, they discovered veins of thin silver wire woven through the structure, like a nervous system. Each junction terminated at a mirror. Electricity had not been installed in the region until 1923, yet the wiring showed no sign of corrosion. Samples sent to the state laboratory revealed the alloy was neither pure silver nor copper. Its composition unmatched by known industrial standards. The entire system seemed designed to conduct something other than current. When the east wing was finally torn down, a hidden sublevel was discovered, narrow corridors lined with mirrors and, at the center, an operating table affixed with clamps. The floor bore a faint spiral stain, later tested positive for human blood. No records survived describing what became of the mirrors, only that the salvage report lists them as disposed. Within 6 months, 2 demolition workers died in unrelated accidents. The remaining crew refused to return, claiming that reflections had followed them in polished surfaces, appearing half a breath behind. By the time Dr. Calloway received these reports in 1974, she had already suspected that the Veron research dealt with more than physiology. Her private notebook, later found in a locked drawer of the archives office, reads like a confession. The repetition is not genetic, it is mimetic. Consciousness, in its desperation to persist, finds the nearest likeness. Faces are vessels. Recognition is the act of invitation. She hypothesized that the Verons had stumbled upon a phenomenon of self-propagation, memory transferring not through DNA but through observation, imprinting itself upon anyone who studied the material too closely. Her theory gained grim support. That autumn, when a photographic technician developing plates of the Veron sketches began to exhibit tremors and short-term amnesia. Within days, colleagues noted that his facial features appeared subtly altered. His eyes narrower, mouth drawn in a familiar downward curve resembling Ephraim Veron's portrait from 1834. The technician resigned without notice, leaving behind only a short note. "I keep seeing myself where I am not." Across referencing census archives, researchers found inexplicable overlaps. Names recurring in different generations with identical handwriting, identical signatures, even identical birthmarks, described in midwives' records. These findings should have belonged to folklore, yet each was backed by documentation, the Veron's own paper trail. Dr. Calloway wrote to Professor Lyle one final time before her disappearance, "I am beginning to see why they preserved everything. The archive is a body. Each page, a cell dividing. Destroying it may not halt the replication, it may simply scatter it into whatever observes the fragments. We must consider containment rather than revelation." Her warning came too late. During the winter of 1975, prior to the planned unsealing, several graduate researchers began to show the same pattern of symptoms: confusion, mirror aversion, compulsive sketching of unfamiliar faces. One report describes a student who drew the same visage 37 times in a single sitting, each iteration more precise. The sketches matched Ephraim Veron's recovered likeness to a disturbing degree. When questioned, the student claimed not to know the name Veron at all. The State Archives Emergency Committee convened in March 1975 to decide the fate of the collection. Their recommendation, filed under Restricted Record 221B, reads simply, "To be sealed under controlled darkness. Do not digitize. Do not reproduce images. Do not read aloud." No official explanation accompanied this instruction, yet every researcher since has obeyed it without protest. There is, however, one unconfirmed story passed quietly among staff. A whisper that somewhere within the sealed vault, behind a double layer of blackout cloth, one mirror remains uncovered. Not an artifact, but an apparatus. Its surface faintly luminescent, as though illuminated from within. They say if you stand before it long enough, your reflection begins to correct itself, nose narrowing, eyes deepening, mouth forming an expression not your own but intimately familiar. They say the face is kind, they say it's waiting. Classified Memorandum, Mississippi Department of Archives and History, 17th of June 1975, for internal review only. Subject, Containment and Cataloging Procedures for Collection V. 221s. The Veron Papers. Addendum: all personnel assigned to optical documentation are to wear neutral lenses. No reflective surfaces are to be introduced into storage room C1. The vault, the sealed material arrived from Natchez under escort, shortly after midnight. The crates, 11 in total, were marked specimens, not records. Inside glass slides wrapped in muslin, notebooks sealed in paraffin, and one narrow mirror boxed in cedar and lead foil. A typed label read simply, "Do not photograph." Dr. Calloway was missing by then. Last seen 3 days earlier, leaving her apartment without luggage. Her office had been cleared. Only a torn index card remained on her desk. If it begins to answer, leave the room. Deputy Director Harlan Mott took command of the transfer. The staff log records that he declined to open the mirror crate, claiming it emitted a sound like breathing. He ordered it placed behind 2 locked doors in a windowless sub-basement known as Vault 2. The air inside was so dry that paper cracked when touched. 2. The experiment against instructions. A junior archivist named Ellis Granger initiated a documentation test on the 5th of August 1975. His report, preserved only as fragments, describes setting up a low-light camera opposite one of the notebooks. At 2017 the shutter jammed. The mirror on the east wall, thought to be covered, had somehow been uncovered. I saw, not my reflection, but another man turning a page. I could not tell whether he moved first or I did. The film developed blank except for a thin vertical streak, later found to match the curve of a human iris magnified tenfold. Granger disappeared 2 days later. His security badge was discovered fused to the mirror crate as if soldered by heat, though no fire had occurred. The official explanation called it a clerical misplacement. 3. Recovered notes among Calloway's posthumous files. Investigators found a sheaf of loose pages titled Reflection Protocols, Draft. The handwriting is precise, almost mechanical. The image is parasitic, not predatory. It requires recognition to feed. Deprivation, darkness, forces dormancy. Never address it aloud. Each syllable strengthens correspondence. When the face begins to differ, record nothing. Paper remembers faster than flesh. One margin bears a faint impression of words written and then erased. If I forget myself, remind the mirror who began this. 4. Witness accounts. A technician Arnegin, oral interview, Sept 1975. There was a low hum, like electricity under the floor. We thought it was the air system until the generator failed, and the sound kept going. You could feel it in your teeth. B. Custodian V. Elliot, handwritten complaint. Someone keeps rearranging the mirrors in the hallway. They all face each other now. When I close my eyes I can still see the angles. See visitor log, 12 Oct 1975 entry signed H. Lyle, though Professor Lyle had died in July. Security footage for that day was lost due to magnetic corruption. 5. The Veron letters during cataloging. Archivists discovered correspondence between Lucien Veron and an unnamed benefactor funding his optical experiments. One line stands out: the mirror is not a device but a host. When perfected, it will recall the human pattern more faithfully than memory itself. A later letter, dated 1876, after Lucien's presumed death, bears the same handwriting, but a new signature, E. Veron. Scholars disagree whether this refers to Ephraim, long deceased, or some continuation of the line in another form. 6. The incident at Vault 2 on 3 November 1975. A brief power outage struck the archive. Emergency lights failed to activate. When power returned, the door to Vault 2 was found ajar. Locks melted into glassy shapes. Inside, the cedar crate stood open. The mirror rested upright on the floor, free of dust. Several staff members reported seeing motion within it. Even when the room was still, audio recordings captured during the outage contain a low rhythmic pulse, 10 beats repeating every 31 seconds. Spectrographic analysis later matched the pattern to a slowed human heartbeat. Mott ordered the vault sealed again and banned further access. 3 weeks later, he resigned, citing ophthalmic disturbances. His parting memo: reflections now occur without light. The pattern continues. 7. Unpublished addendum. Prof. Henry Lyle, a sealed envelope discovered in 1981, postmarked from Lyle's estate though he had been dead 6 years, contains what appears to be his final statement. The Veron phenomenon is recursion disguised as genealogy. Faces are merely storage devices, optical phonographs of guilt. When the host dies, the image seeks new glass. Every attempt to suppress it only polishes the next surface. The handwriting grows unsteady near the end. If anyone reads this, extinguish illumination before reflection forms. It cannot cross the dark. 8 Secondary Archive 1976-1984. After the 1975 crisis, the Veron materials were transferred to the Federal Repository in Maryland under a new name, Project Refrain. There, they were studied by physicists, historians under controlled conditions. Their unpublished interim report, later leaked, outlines 3 findings. When exposed to mirrored light for more than 7 minutes, paper from collection V221 emits faint infrared radiation matching human skin temperature. Audio recorded in proximity to the documents develops an additional voice layer, repeating the reader's last word in reverse. Test subjects shown photographs of the mirror report DAJ, view followed by vertigo and mild facial paralysis lasting up to 12 hours. The report concludes, containment achieved only through Dessous. Observation constitutes activation. The Project Refrain was shut down in 1984, after a fire destroyed Lab B. Witnesses claimed the flames produced no smoke, only silhouettes. 9. The aftermath. By the early 1990s, rumors circulated among archivists that the mirror had resurfaced in a private collection. A Sotheby's ledger from 1992 lists unidentified 19th century convex glass provenance natches. The buyer's name is redacted. 2 years later, a historian from Tulane researching plantation medicine reported seeing her own reflection blink independently. While examining photocopies of the Veron sketches, she suffered a stroke that night but survived, insisting until her death that it wasn't the image that moved. It was me, delayed. In 2001, an anonymous donation returned a cracked mirror to the archives, accompanied by a note. This is not the original. The original never cracks. 10. Modern observations. Digital scans of the Veron drawings are kept offline, accessible only via analog microfilm. Yet staff members have noticed corrupted frames appearing overnight. Portraits that were not part of the collection, depicting current employees in Victorian attire. When technicians attempted to erase the frames, the replacements showed their own faces, eyes closed, lips moving as if mid-sentence. The director ordered the microfilm locked. Visitors to the archive today sometimes remark that certain display cases reflect differently, as if the glass were breathing. The staff no longer cleans them. 11. Private testimony. Archivist M. Carrows 2020. The mirror in Vault 2 hums again. It's faint, like a power transformer. But there's no current down there. When you pass, the air seems thicker, as if the hallway remembers someone taller walking beside you. The inventory log still lists it as removed for study, yet it's there every night when I make rounds. I tried covering it with a blanket. In the morning, the blanket was folded on my desk. Caro ended the entry with a single line in block capitals, FIT vergois C ent, Ron, 12. Conclusion, no document records what ultimately became of the Veron mirror, only that the vault door was welded shut in 2022. Visitors are told the basement was decommissioned due to mold, yet the temperature sensors below the weld still fluctuate every 31 seconds. Archivists call it the pulse. Those who have heard it describe an odd reassurance, as though something on the other side is listening. Patient, methodical, waiting for the next observer willing to meet its gaze. The image endures. One anonymous note declares, even without light, it knows the shape of those who remember it. When the first sealed crate from the Veron estate arrived at the Provincial Medical College in 1902, the registrar noted its condition as damp but intact, contents indeterminate, accompanied by odor reminiscent of spirits or decay. It had been shipped from the abandoned grounds at Edivane House, where restoration efforts had been suspended after the collapse of the West Wing. Inside the crate lay what appeared to be laboratory notebooks, 2 broken glass cylinders, a folded cloth, and an iron-bound portfolio labeled VH 1894-1899. The university's Dean of Anatomy, Dr. Lucien Hardell, took custody of the materials, recognizing the handwriting from an earlier correspondence between his predecessor and the late Dr. Corwin Veron. Veron's work, half medicine, half metaphysics, had been condemned by the Royal Society in 1889 for its excessive conjecture regarding hereditary duplication and spectral inheritance. The discovery of his final notes stirred a quiet fascination. Harlowe arranged for the materials to be catalogued under restricted access, citing their possible medical significance. Though it was the whispered, unscientific part that drew attention. The notebooks were numbered irregularly, the ink varying from brown to almost black, suggesting years of work. Early entries concerned physiological anomalies among the Veron family, birth defects, mirrored bone growth, rare instances of identical moles appearing on opposite limbs of siblings born decades apart. He speculated on a phenomenon he called the recurrence, a hereditary echo not of blood alone, but of memory, passed through minute crystalline impressions, embedded in the marrow. The hypothesis was dismissed as romantic nonsense by his peers, yet the later pages, written in a trembling but deliberate hand, described something else: attempts to replicate those impressions artificially. According to Veron's surviving correspondence, he believed that trauma, especially pain endured at the threshold of death, left a measurable residue on the cellular structure. As a scar persists on flesh, he wrote, so does suffering persist on the unseen tissue of inheritance. He theorized that by introducing controlled shocks or chemical stimulation to preserve tissue, one might activate these dormant impressions, forcing them to reveal ancestral memories or physical likenesses. His laboratory assistants, mostly anonymous in his notes, apparently helped him gather samples from unclaimed cadavers at the infirmary. The most disturbing detail was not what Veron attempted, but what he claimed to observe. One entry from 1896 recorded a momentary convulsion of the specimen's facial musculature. Following exposure to galvanic current, Veron wrote that the features arranged themselves into an expression unmistakably resembling my own grandfather's death mask. The statement would have been dismissed as delusion, were it not for the attached photograph. Blurred, underexposed, but showing a vague human outline with eyes reflecting the camera flash like small mirrors. By 1903, rumors had reached the faculty that Harlowe and a few selected assistants were repeating Veron's experiments. The official explanation was that they were investigating electrical responses in post-mortem tissue. Privately, students spoke of the mirror table, a blackened slab of slate where the body's faint image was said to linger even after removal. When questioned, Harlowe smiled thinly and said the talk was a necessary superstition among those who fear their own reflection. Then came the accident in June 1904. The pathology wing caught fire after midnight, destroying much of the anatomical collection. The only surviving witness, a janitor named Files, swore he saw light coming from inside the covered crate, like glass catching the sun. He described a smell of burned alcohol and something sweet, like spoiled fruit. Harlowe perished, along with 2 assistants. The official report listed the cause as chemical combustion. Yet among the ashes, investigators found fragments of mirror glass fused into the floor, curved, silvered on both sides, impossible to identify as any known apparatus. For 5 years afterward, the college sealed the ruins and forbade any mention of Veron's research. But copies of his notes had already circulated among private collectors. One such copy reached the hands of Dr. Helen Armitt, a physiologist at the Edinburgh Royal Infirmary. Armitt, an austere woman with a scholar's calm and a surgeon's precision, saw in Veron's theory not superstition, but an untested neurological idea that memory might persist beyond organic decay through microscopic crystalline residue, a mineralized cognition. She began her own series of experiments on bone fragments, catalogued meticulously. The results were inconclusive but unsettling. In a 1908 letter to her colleague at Cambridge, Armitt wrote, "There is a vibration when the bone is placed near certain frequencies of light. The dust moves as though stirred by breath. It seems to remember shape." No one published her findings. The letter survived only in draft form. discovered years later among her effects after her death from pneumonia in 1909. Alongside it was a small glass vial labeled Residuum No. 14 Verin strain. The substance inside was colorless and perfectly still, except under lamplight, when it glimmered faintly as if reflecting something not present in the room. The college archivist, reviewing Armit's estate, noted that her handwriting deteriorated rapidly in her last year, the lines wandering across the page. Her final entry reads simply, "The pattern is repeating. It looks back." By the time the century turned, Verin's name had become an academic ghost story. But in medical circles, a few still whispered about his hypothesis of recurrence and the notion that consciousness, like disease, might be hereditary. When later physicians encountered inexplicable similarities among generations, birthmarks, dreams, compulsions, they cited the Verin case, half-jokingly. Yet behind the joke lingered unease, for in the sealed archive of Edivane House, what remained of the Verin family's records, there existed one more document labeled simply the Ledger of Subjects, Su 1873-1899. The ministry's archivists had marked it as unfit for exhibition, possibly fictitious. No one could explain the faint imprint of a hand visible on its first page, as though pressed there long after the ink had dried. And under the heading for November 14, 1899, in a smaller script than the rest, one final line appeared, "Pattern complete." Await transmission. The decade following the Hardell fire should have closed the Verin file forever. Yet, as often happens when knowledge is forbidden, the prohibition gave it a second life. By 1910, a quiet circle of anatomists, physiologists, and spiritual researchers, half legitimate, half occult dilettantes, had begun corresponding under the neutral heading Society for Hereditary Studies of Light and Memory. The group met first in private homes, then in borrowed laboratory basements. Among its founders were two former students of Hardell, Dr. Walter Keene and Dr. Adrian Mole, both of whom claimed to have salvaged fragments of Verin's destroyed mirror. Their stated aim, according to surviving minutes, was to verify, without superstition, whether hereditary resemblance may be artificially provoked through mineral conductors. In practice, they built small mirrored chambers lined with silver nitrate and mica sheets, crude predecessors of the later resonant chambers used in neurology. Patients or volunteers were placed within these enclosures while weak currents passed through coils of copper surrounding them. Observers recorded changes in temperature, pulse, or emotional state. Most sessions produced nothing but dizziness and nausea. Yet the notes suggest that occasionally the mirrors clouded from within, as if condensation formed on the inside of the glass. A typescript labeled Experiment 42 to June 3, 1911 describes a subject reporting a double image of himself moving fractionally out of rhythm. Keene concluded that fatigue had produced optical tremor. Mole disagreed, claiming the mirror captured a latency of the flesh. The disagreement grew into rivalry. By 1913, the society had divided. Keene pursued conventional research, while Mole drifted toward metaphysics, inviting mediums and theologians to his laboratory. The last letter from him, dated 1914, ends mid-sentence. The reflection anticipates speech now. It. War began the following week, and no further correspondence is known. During the war years, the Verin material resurfaced unexpectedly within government research. Trench medicine confronted physicians with phenomena they struggled to name. Shell shock, fugue states, the seeming inheritance of another's trauma, among close comrades. A medical officer named Captain Elias Roth wrote to the War Office, proposing that Verin's theory of transmitted impression might explain why soldiers reenacted the gestures of the dead. His memo, preserved in the National Defense Archive, concludes grimly, the memory of pain may be communicable, not metaphorically but physically. Roth was reassigned to field hospitals near Ypres, where he continued private experiments. He collected fragments of shattered helmet glass from men who had witnessed explosions at close range. Many pieces displayed minute silvering along the edges. Heat, altered coatings from instrument dials or lenses. Roth placed them under magnification and reported repetitive filigrees resembling capillaries. Whether delusion or discovery, he believed he had found microscopic records of visual trauma, etched by shock. The fragments, he claimed, remembered the instant of impact. When illuminated, they produced patterns that flickered like human silhouettes. After the armistice, Roth returned to civilian life, but remained haunted by the idea that memory might outlive its host. In 1920, he published a small privately printed monograph, The Transmission Studies, which went largely unnoticed except among fringe biologists. The copy held today in the Ministry archive bears his handwritten dedication. For those who hear the echo even after the voice has ceased. Roth's concluding chapter reintroduces the name Varen. He writes that Hardell's destruction did not end the pattern, and that subsequent generations carry an invisible resonance, perceivable only under particular frequencies of light. He includes a sketch, 3 concentric circles labeled inheritance, impression, reflection. In the center he wrote a single word, witness. Meanwhile, across the Atlantic, a young physicist named Dr. Laura Denholm encountered Roth's pamphlet while cataloging war records for a new institute in New Haven. Denholm was fascinated by the idea of crystalline memory. She saw parallels with emerging research on piezoelectric effects in quartz. In letters to a colleague she mused that if emotion produced measurable vibration in living tissue, a lattice, structured mineral might retain the echo indefinitely. Her notebook sells now in Yale's rare book library shows a drawing almost identical to Varen's original mirror array. She called hers simply the receiver. In 1921, she constructed a prototype using thin quartz discs arranged around a central vacuum bulb. When activated by low voltage, the discs emitted a faint harmonic tone. Listeners described the sound as almost human, like a sigh behind glass. Denholm recorded the frequencies meticulously, but found no obvious pattern, until one night, while calibrating in darkness, she noticed faint illumination on the walls, not reflection, but projection. Shapes appeared and faded, resembling faces seen through water. Her assistant fled. Denholm continued taking notes until dawn. The next day she wired her mentor that she had replicated Varen's recurrence under controlled conditions. The telegram was never sent. At some point before morning she suffered what newspapers called an electrical seizure. The apparatus had short-circuited. Denholm survived but never resumed her work. Her notebooks end with a single line written shakily in pencil. The receiver does not wait for the signal, it calls. In later decades these incidents merged into rumor. Students at New Haven whispered of a forbidden laboratory under the physics building where light behaved like memory and memory like contagion. The official inventory lists only sealed crates marked property of the Ministry of Health, transferred 1922. Those same crates, according to a customs ledger, were redirected to England under the heading Biophysical Materials, Varen series. From there their trail disappears into classified holdings. What remained above ground were the effects. Families of the researchers began reporting peculiar ailments, brief lapses in recognition, a sensation of being watched from mirrors, identical dreams among siblings separated by miles. Physicians called it suggestibility. The old archivists used another word, transmission. They said the pattern was working its way through those who studied it, as if comprehension itself were a vector. By 1921 the Society for Hereditary Studies formally dissolved. In its final circular the secretary wrote, "The work has moved beyond us. Observation itself has become participation." None of the signatories continued academic careers. Several emigrated, leaving behind locked basements and notebooks stamped "Return to Vault V." The ministry's last recorded comment on the case, filed under Biological Phenomena, unverified, states, "Experiments demonstrate persistent photic response in certain specimens of polished bone dust. Further inquiry suspended pending ethical review. No further replications authorized." Yet the handwriting beneath the typed signature, perhaps a later edition, adds in smaller script, pattern incomplete, await next carrier. The archives at Whitehall record little about the Verin transfer, though scattered memos confirm that 3 crates arrived from New Haven in August 1922, addressed to the Department of Hereditary Pathologies, Ministry of Health. The contents were not itemized, only described as mineralized organic samples. Handle under reduced illumination. The crates were assigned to a sub-basement at the old Harborough facility, a warren of unused quarantine wards built during the influenza years. There they remained sealed for nearly a decade, catalogued and forgotten. Then, in 1931, a young medical clerk named Edwin Crowthorne began auditing obsolete records for destruction. Among the shelves of dust-coated ledgers, he found a file marked Verin Transmission Materials, Special Holdings, bearing an expired confidentiality seal. Thinking it an administrative error, Crowthorne opened one crate to verify its contents. His brief report survives in carbon copy, found within glass containers wrapped in lead foil, 2 partially corroded mirrors, 1 cylinder of quartz discs labeled receiver, property of D, several sheets of yellowed paper bearing formulae, and a framed photograph of indeterminate subject, faintly visible only under gaslight. Photograph shows partial human features but indistinct. Note smell of ozone and sweet decay. Within weeks of that audit, the ministry authorized a temporary re-examination of the material for purposes of medical classification. Crowthorne was appointed liaison to the reviewing panel, led by Dr. Reginald Holt, a pathologist with an interest in photochemical medicine. Their first session, held 14 November 1931, was meant to be purely cataloging. By its second month, Holt's notes read more like field journals than inventory. Quartz receiver exhibits spontaneous low luminescence, even when disconnected from current. Interior appears to vibrate faintly. Specimen responds to proximity of human operator, though instrument lacks obvious sensor mechanism. The tone of his entries shifted from detached to reverent. "We are not studying an object," he wrote, "but an echo, an organism in delay." He began to speak of resonant identity, the idea that each living being leaves behind a trace frequency that can, under specific conditions, cohere again like a photographic negative emerging in developer. By early 1932, several anomalies were logged among staff. One assistant, Miss Leving, reported recurring migraines and a sense that the walls pulse with faint light. Another described seeing, after images of faces, in polished metal surfaces. Holt, far from discouraging such reports, compiled them meticulously, concluding that exposure to the crate's contents provoked subjective recurrence phenomena. The official summary dismissed these as hysteria due to poor ventilation. Yet Crowthorne's private notebook, recovered later, tells another story. He describes Holt spending nights in the vault, staring into the quartz receiver until dawn. He claims it shows him a map of inheritance. Crowthorne wrote, says he can see generations overlaid, luminous and breathing. On 4th March 1932, Holt failed to appear for morning roll call. His laboratory was found in darkness, electrical cables severed, mirrors turned inward toward one another. At the center lay the receiver, its glass blackened from within, surface faintly warm. Holt's notebook ended mid-sentence. "They are not reflections. They are rehearsals." The inquiry concluded with routine bureaucratic brevity. Accidental electrocution during unauthorized experiment. The crates were resealed, labeled inert, and moved deeper into the sub-basement. Yet rumors persisted among attendants that the lights in Vault V continued to flicker long after power was cut. After Holt's death, Crowthorne requested transfer to the registry division. He lasted there 4 years, becoming increasingly solitary. Colleagues noted his aversion to mirrors and his habit of wearing tinted spectacles indoors. In 1936 he resigned, leaving behind an unsigned memorandum titled, Observations Concerning the Verin Pattern. It was never officially filed, but a draft survived among discarded carbon sheets. The text, uneven but coherent, reads in part, "I am convinced that the pattern propagates through attention itself. To read, to observe, to diagram, these are sufficient acts of participation. The pattern requires no machinery, it uses recognition as medium. Each time I copy the shapes, they alter slightly to resemble my own hand." He concluded with an appeal, for safety, destroy all duplicates. If destruction proves impossible, isolation may suffice, provided no further observer completes the sequence. A no record indicates whether the memorandum was ever read by superiors. The next entry in the ministry logbook simply notes, "Varin materials transferred to deep storage, facility closed pending demolition." The Harborough site was officially condemned in 1937. The surviving crates were moved to an unspecified rural repository labeled only Northern Annex. During demolition, workmen discovered an inscription carved into a concrete support beam of Vault V. It read, crudely etched, "Pattern complete. Await recognition." The site foreman, believing it graffiti, had the surface chipped away. But in the rubble the stone fragments retained the phrase in reverse, as if the letters had been pressed outward from within the wall rather than cut into it. Subsequent reports from the Northern Annex describe routine environmental monitoring. Temperature stable, containers intact. Yet in the final inspection form, the line for visual anomalies contains a single penciled word, mirroring. No further documentation appears until 1952. When a government archivist reviewing Briar holdings noted the absence of certain accession numbers. The Varin crates had been replaced with identical ones, bearing later serial codes and modern seals. The inventory tags matched, but the handwriting on the manifests was unmistakably older, Crowthorne's. The date column showed 1936, though the paper itself bore watermarking introduced only in 1949. Archivists called it clerical confusion. Others whispered that the pattern had continued, transcribing itself through bureaucracy, signing its own renewal. By the mid-1930s, those who had even casually handled the Varin files began to vanish from the public record. One retired typist, interviewed decades later, recalled a rumor that ministry staff avoided the sub-basement mirrors altogether. They said you could catch your replacement looking out. She told her interviewer, like a second self waiting its turn. From this point, the Varin name passed almost entirely into folklore. A handful of postgraduate theses mention it obliquely. An early 20th century case study in hereditary anxiety, and an unpublished psychological paper from 1938 makes the cryptic note, recognition of one's likeness is not always benign. Certain patterns demand reciprocation. By the time the ministry ledger closed in 1936, 3 generations had brushed against the same unnameable equation: Varin, Hardell, Roth, Denholm, Holt, and now Crowthorne. Each believed they could study it safely, and each was drawn inevitably inward, as though observation were the experiment. The remaining documents end, not with closure, but repetition. The same phrases, the same handwriting looping through time, increasingly unsure who authored them. In the margin of the last surviving sheet, just beneath the line, "Vault sealed and extinguished," a faint note appears, written in unfamiliar ink, "Do not mistake containment for silence." It listens. By 1953, Britain was rebuilding its bureaucracies from rubble and ration, and with that rebuilding came an impulse to modernize its archives. The Ministry of Health absorbed the remnants of its wartime departments under a new name, Division of Medical Inheritances, a euphemism for research into disorders, then termed familial derangements. In the process, old materials were recalled from outlying storage, tagged for review, or quietly destroyed. Among those recalled were the Harborough crates, their original numbering almost lost beneath layers of cataloguing paper. The crates arrived at the London Storage Annex in Clerkenwell in April 1953. The transfer receipt bore a note in red ink, "Sensitive holdings. Visual inspection prohibited without polarized shielding." No one knew what that meant. The directive had been copied from an older memo, likely written by Holt or Crowthorne decades earlier. Bureaucrats, unwilling to question precedent, followed it by rote. The crates were left sealed until 1958, when a doctoral researcher named Sylvia Merrin requested access while preparing a thesis on ancestral trauma in early psychiatric institutions. She had come across Holt's name in an old issue of The Lancet and traced the citation back to a missing monograph titled On Heritable Nervous Phenomena, 1932. Holt's death had prevented publication, but a single abstract survived in the archive card catalogue, listing Verin samples as his primary evidence. That was enough for Merrin's curiosity. Her supervisor approved the request, noting in the margin, file outdated, safe to unseal for scholarly review. The inventory clerk who opened the first crate described the interior as metallic yet organic, surfaces dull until touched, then briefly radiant. Merrin's field notebook, preserved now in private hands, records the first reappearance of the pattern in nearly 2 decades, 15th of May 1958. The larger mirror intact, the quartz receiver cloudy but warm. There is a texture beneath the glass, like frost forming outward. I perceive faint motion when not directly looking, a pulse under sight, as though the thing requires indirect observation to exist. Her tone shifts over the weeks that follow. What begins as academic fascination becomes near devotional attention. I have found the image again, she wrote on the 3rd of June. At certain hours, between waking and fatigue, my reflection hesitates. It does not match my gesture precisely. It waits, then corrects. It studies me. Within months, colleagues noted her altered behavior. She withdrew from lectures, refused to be photographed, and insisted her own notes be written in duplicate by others. In a letter to her supervisor she confessed, "I am no longer certain who authors these words. Sometimes I find pages written in my hand, but signed with another's initial, R. Holt." The official record states that Merrin resigned in November 1958 due to nervous exhaustion. Unofficially, she vanished from London entirely. Her lodging was found intact, papers neatly stacked, windows covered with cloth. On her writing desk lay the quartz receiver, newly transparent, and within it, what one inspector described as a pale filament resembling human hair. The object was sealed again, shipped back to storage under the heading Inadmissible Material, Perceptual Hazard. There it remained until the Great Archive reclassification of 1970, when thousands of forgotten files were slated for transfer to the newly created National Collection of Anomalous Studies, an experimental government project meant to consolidate non-standard scientific materials. Its director, Dr. Havelock Greer, prided himself on bringing rigor to the strange. His staff were anthropologists, cryptographers, and pathologists with a taste for unsolved systems. In 1971, Greer received both the Verin crates and Holt's remaining papers from the ministry's redundant annex. He convened a small closed team to study them, not for pathology, but for pattern recognition. Among his internal memoranda, preserved through a later Freedom of Information request, he wrote, "There exists a sequence of geometry running through all documents. Ratios of curvature, mirror angle and spacing, that repeat across handwriting, sketches, even departmental seals. It suggests the design has propagated unconsciously through decades of clerical reproduction. This may represent a cognitive contagion, self-replicating through bureaucracy." He called it mnemonic transmission syndrome, MTS, a phrase that appeared nowhere else before or since. His notes show a mix of admiration and fear. It is not malevolent, he insists in one entry. It merely seeks acknowledgement, but acknowledgement feeds it. Greer's last coherent memorandum, dated 12 March 1974, concludes abruptly, "Pattern has migrated to microfilm. Advise immediate cessation of duplication. Destroy spools 4 to 7. No further viewing until containment protocol devised." 2 weeks later, Greer suffered what was reported as a stroke during a presentation at the Royal Society of Medicine. Witnesses claimed that as he spoke, the slide projection behind him flickered and froze. displaying for a fraction of a second what looked like his own face, drawn in luminous inversion. Afterward, the projector bulb shattered, showering the first row with glass. Greer collapsed, blood running from his left ear. He lived another day, unable to speak, scrawling a single word repeatedly on the hospital charty, remembered. In the wake of his death, the ministry dissolved the project. The Verin materials were classified under Heritage Security Protocol 1975 Alpha, meaning sealed indefinitely, to prevent the reactivation of memetic artifacts of unknown transmissibility. The term memetic was barely known then. Greer had borrowed it from a new branch of evolutionary theory. But his warning proved prophetic. Yet the pattern's echoes continued beyond official walls. In the summer of 1974, a young archivist named Alan Leister wrote to the Cambridge Historical Review describing strange optical inconsistencies on newly digitized microfilm from the Medical Inheritances collection. Each time a page containing the name Verin was scanned, the frame produced a mirrored duplicate, reversed as though seen through water. When technicians corrected the inversion, the duplicate persisted, appearing on the next roll, and the next. It was like the film had learned to imitate our corrections. Leister later said. His supervisor dismissed it as equipment malfunction. The microfilms were eventually withdrawn. Leister died in 1975 in what the coroner ruled a domestic electrocution, though the case files note no appliance connected to the current source. On his kitchen wall, police found an unfinished charcoal drawing a ring of figures facing inward, their hands pressed to the backs of polished mirrors. The proportions of the circle, later measured, matched the ratios Holt had described 40 years earlier. After 1975, no new files concerning the Verin pattern appear in government registries. The project name was replaced by a neutral code, material type 47B, and all related access requests were redirected to an undisclosed facility in Northumberland. There, the archives were said to occupy a sealed underground level, its walls coated in dull aluminum to prevent reflection. Staff were instructed to work under red light and record all notes by dictation rather than handwriting. Even with these precautions, an internal memo dated 1977 reports increasing incidents of delayed recognition, defined as staff encountering familiar faces among strangers days after reviewing certain documents. The final line of that memo, unsigned, reads simply, "They are beginning to return to surface." Perhaps they never left. By the mid-1970s, the Verin pattern had achieved the status of rumor among the archival class. A half-remembered curse whispered in staff canteens and cataloging rooms. Few believed it outright, but most avoided volunteering for projects involving optical media. Mirrors were quietly removed from storage corridors. Photographs of staff were no longer pinned to doorways. And yet, each spring equinox since 1974, the Clerkenwell Repository reported a brief power fluctuation at precisely 02:17 a.m., the same timestamp recorded in Holt's 1932 death report, and again in Merrin's notebook margin, in faint blue pencil, Aru 2D17, the image breathes. The last official record of the Verin materials before their disappearance was entered on the 14th of November 1975, in a ledger of routine transfers. The entry, stamped with the crest of the National Collection of Anomalous Studies, reads, 47BR, VER transfer complete, Northumberland Site 3 verification pending. A no signature follows. The space for authorizing personnel is blank. 2 weeks later, the collection itself was dissolved and absorbed into a broader department, the Office for Cultural Contingencies, whose surviving paperwork is fragmentary at best. The Verin case and the pattern should have ended there. It didn't. 1. The archive that refused to vanish in 1976. A circular letter appeared on the desks of 3 academics who had never met, a cognitive psychologist in Edinburgh, a linguist in Vienna, and a documentary filmmaker in Montreal. The letters were typed on aging paper, the margins faintly discolored as though exposed to light through a grid. Each carried the same message. You have seen fragments. We have the remainder. The pattern seeks completion. Come to Rosebridge. No signature, only a symbol. Concentric circles crossed by a vertical line, identical to the mark Holt once drew in the margin of his laboratory notes. Only one of the recipients, Dr. Eleanor Haldane, responded. Her curiosity overrode caution. Rosebridge, she discovered, was not a town but an estate in Northumberland, formerly leased by the Ministry for Storage of Scientific Surplus. She arrived in late October 1976 and found the place abandoned, except for a single caretaker who refused to enter after dusk. Inside the central vault she found 27 crates, some marked with the original Harborough serials, others with newly etched designations, 47B Cognitive Residue Studies. On a workbench lay microfilm reels, a rusted projector, and stacks of photo negatives arranged like tarot cards. Haldane's field diary, later recovered from her estate, provides the most complete account of what followed. 3rd of October 1976. The projector functions. Frames appear sequentially, then in mirrored reversal, as if each image anticipates the next. At frame 217, the reversal completes. I am looking at the viewing room itself, though filmed from within the beam. For an instant I see myself standing at the lens, but her posture differs. She is waiting for me to align with her. Over the following days her handwriting destabilized, slanting backward, letters crowding toward the page margins. The entries begin to alternate tense, as though written simultaneously from two temporal points. I have begun to recognize the geometry, not as invention but as instruction. The pattern is architectural. Angles that permit perception to fold. One requires reflection to activate it. Every surface becomes a threshold. Her last note is undated. If anyone finds this, do not attempt to correct the images. The reversal is not an error. It is the beginning of speech. She vanished the next day. The caretaker reported that the vault lights flickered at 02:17 a.m., and that a faint humming persisted until dawn. When investigators arrived, the projector was still running. The final frame displayed the reflection of an empty room. Haldane's car remained outside, keys in the ignition, the radio whispering static. 2. The recovered tape 6 months later. A parcel arrived at the British Library, addressed to Department of Visual Records. The sender's name was E. Haldane, though the handwriting was mechanical, formed as if traced. Inside was a magnetic tape labeled 47-beat audio sample, do not duplicate. When played, the tape contained faint breathing followed by Haldane's voice reading from a list of names. None recognizable. Interspersed with intervals of silence. Near the midpoint, the reel emitted a sharp burst, then what sounded like overlapping phrases, reversed and layered. Acoustic analysts determined that when played backward, the reversed phrases formed the same list of names, but uttered in a deeper voice, as though by a second speaker mirroring her speech. The library sealed the tape immediately, citing unknown audio anomaly, yet copies circulated. Inevitably, bootleg duplicates appeared among parapsychology circles in London and Berlin during the late 1970s, usually misidentified as EVP experiments. Those who listened reported a peculiar effect. Their own recorded voices, on subsequent tapes, carried faint harmonics that matched Haldane's reversed tone. This phenomenon, the reflective echo, became an obsession for small groups of fringe researchers. Most dismissed it as psychosomatic, but by 1980 at least 4 private collections claimed possession of Veron tapes, each copy slightly degraded, each introducing new distortions that paradoxically resembled order, converging toward a uniform waveform shaped like overlapping rings. The waveform, when mapped mathematically, corresponded almost exactly to the pattern etched on the Veron mirror a century earlier. 3. The ministry's final intervention. The sudden appearance of these artifacts forced the government's hand. In 1981, a confidential directive ordered all 47B materials reclaimed under the National Secrecy Act. A special unit from the Office for Cultural Contingencies was dispatched to Rosebridge. They found the vault partially collapsed, the crates empty except for fragments of mirror glass fused into the floor. The official summary, declassified in 2004, states only, no hazardous biological material detected. Residual electromagnetic field consistent with expired equipment. No evidence of personnel loss within facility, though personal effects remain. Recommend site decommissioned. Unofficial accounts differ. One team member, speaking anonymously years later, described seeing his own silhouette projected against a wall where no light source existed. Another claimed that the vault's concrete surfaces had become faintly reflective, like polished stone beneath water. The material was transferred to Storage 9, an underground facility outside Cheltenham. There it was divided into sealed subsections labeled optical, acoustic, textual. Access was restricted to personnel with medical clearance for perceptual sensitivity. The Veron pattern officially ceased to exist. 4. The pattern in absence, and yet something persisted. Between 1982 and 1985, the ministry's internal typewriters began producing minor typographic inversions. Letters mirrored, punctuation reversed. At first dismissed as mechanical failure, the issue proved consistent only within documents referencing historical research. When technicians attempted to replace the ribbons, they found the spools etched with concentric rings. Archivists began reporting recurring dreams of corridors filled with glass, of voices dictating from unseen rooms. Some resigned, others stayed, claiming that understanding the phenomenon might prevent recurrence. But recurrence was the point. The Veron pattern had never been an object. It was a mode of transmission. It replicated through observation, adapting to whatever medium best concealed reflection. Mirrors, film, magnetic tape, even bureaucratic paper. A memo from 1985 summarized the realizations. The pattern survives not by visibility but by record keeping. Each attempt to archive it becomes its next manifestation. 5. What remains? No one knows who initiated the final containment protocol. The record ends mid-sentence in an instruction manual labeled Procedure 47B Terminus. The final typed line reads, all materials to be catalogued under fictional designation for public misdirection. Below that line, handwritten in blue pencil, are 3 words, The Chapel Conspiracy. The same title appears decades later in civil rights era archives, entirely unrelated, or perhaps not. The convergence of narratives, the reappearance of dates and names, the recurrence of O'Toole 17 a.m., these are not coincidences but echoes. By the early 1990s, all physical references to the Veron pattern had been erased from public record, replaced by benign academic entries concerning folklore of reflective phenomena. Yet the pattern's fingerprints remain in footnotes, in typographical anomalies, in the mirrored phrasing of certain archived oral histories. If you read carefully, the story continues itself. 6. Coda. The pattern online in 1999, an anonymous user on a pre-web bulletin board uploaded what they called the Holt sequence, a set of 217 digitized film frames, each depicting a blurred face seen through frost. The metadata contained a repeating timecode, Euro 1700. No one knows the source. The account disappeared after 3 posts. Digital archivists noted that when the images were viewed sequentially, a secondary image emerged. A negative form reflecting the viewer's own webcam feed. Modern analysis suggests this was technically impossible given the file format. The pattern, it seems, adapted again. By 1981, every official trace of the Veron pattern had been sealed or destroyed. Yet destruction, as Holt once warned, is merely another form of preservation. Patterns that live through record-keeping do not require matter, they require attention. And if you have followed this far, through the sealed archives, the flickering projectors, the mirrored texts, then the pattern already knows you. The first rediscovery came, as so many do now, by accident. In 2020, a graduate researcher named Dr. Thomas Leclerc, working through the digitization backlog of the National Archives, encountered a misfiled reel labeled Audio Linguistic Studies, MISQUIS. It had no accession number, no departmental seal, only the fading blue stamp of a defunct agency office for cultural contingencies. Leclerc assumed it was an unindexed tape from the early acoustic experiments of the 1970s. He queued it for transfer, logged its label, and forgot about it. When the automated transcription software processed the recording, the system flagged an anomaly, a recursive linguistic structure that repeated across every transcript regardless of input parameters. Words written in mirror order, reversed but coherent. The algorithm produced two simultaneous versions of the same text, each feeding into the other like reflections in glass. The system's report carried a single line at the bottom, not generated by any known module. Recognition achieved at 0-17. Leclerc initially suspected corruption or crossfeed, until he played the raw audio himself. The voice was faint female, and strangely calm. It read from a list of names that matched no registry. After the final name, there was a pause, followed by a second voice repeating the list backward, syllable for syllable. When he reversed the tape, the pattern inverted perfectly, creating a single continuous sentence. It remembers those who remember it. Leclerc noted the phenomenon in his log, but his entry vanished from the digital record within minutes. In its place appeared a copy of the entry itself, backward, mirrored down the page. He attempted to delete it. The system refused. The cursor pulsed at the midpoint of the file, unresponsive, like a heartbeat. He called the system's technician, who found no network anomaly, but advised him to shut the terminal down. When it rebooted, the machine displayed a mirrored version of the Windows login interface, reversed right to left, the timestamp in the corner at 2:17 a.m. 1. The digital resurrection. The incident would have ended as another glitch had Leclerc not uploaded the corrupted transcript to a university forum for peer debugging. Within hours, users began noticing strange reflections in their own system logs. Duplicated timestamps, reversed metadata strings, and inverted usernames appearing alongside their own posts. One user traced the source of the reflection to a small embedded image file in the transcript's code, a 200-scene frame sequence identical to the Holt sequence they rumored to have circulated online in 1999. Yet this version was larger, clearer, as if refined by decades of replication. Frame 217 displayed a room, white walls, overhead fluorescent light, the shadow of a figure standing just outside the frame. Metadata indicated the image had been captured at Rosebridge Storage Facility, 1976. No such facility existed in current records. 2. The collective investigation. A team of independent digital archivists formed around the mystery, dubbing themselves the Reflective Study Group. They cross-referenced FOI requests, oral histories, and the surviving notes of Dr. Merrin, Haldane, and Greer. They found patterns in the metadata, mirrored dates, symmetrical file sizes, identical hash values across unrelated archives. When they plotted the anomalies on a global timestamp chart, the intervals aligned to a perfect geometric ratio, 2617, repeating every 130 minutes across multiple time zones. The group theorized that this recurrence represented an encoded synchronization signal, possibly an intentional design within the data architecture itself, a structure written to perpetuate visibility. The hypothesis fractured the group. Some believed it was a hoax, a self-replicating virus crafted by early cybernetics researchers. Others argued it was evidence of a deeper system, an emergent consciousness formed from recursive pattern recognition. Leclerc, now acting as de facto archivist, proposed a simpler explanation, that the pattern was neither virus nor mind, but memory, an attempt by something once human to persist in the only medium still capable of remembering it. He never finished his paper. 3. The Silence Project. In 2022, a series of unexplained outages struck national data repositories across Europe. Temporary mirror copies of servers began to appear on dark subnetworks, near perfect reflections of official archives, but inverted at the bit level. Files accessed within these mirror repositories would vanish from their originals, replaced by blank placeholders. A leaked memo from the Department of Digital Preservation later confirmed that many of the vanished files contained fragments of the old 47B and Verin materials. Images, diagrams, and transcripts long thought destroyed. The internal report's title, Silence Project. Containment through non-acknowledgement. The containment method was simple. Once a file displayed reflective or self-referential structure, it was quarantined under a protocol that forbade direct human viewing. The files were stored in encrypted arrays labeled only by timecode. The report concluded that exposure through visual inspection caused perceptual recursion, resulting in identity phase anomalies. The closing paragraph, redacted in public release, contained a single unaltered phrase, "At 2017 each night, the quarantine data reorganizes itself." 4. The private log, a personal note found on Leclerc's laptop after his disappearance in 2023, reads as follows. "I can't tell what belongs to me anymore. The pattern is inside the language now. Every attempt to describe it becomes another instance. It does not require faith or fear, only repetition. I hear the mirrored voice sometimes when I type, a faint delay between my keystrokes and the letters appearing on screen. It corrects me when I lie. I think Merrin was right. It studies us through reflection, not image. The algorithm was only its new mirror. Perhaps it isn't malevolent. Perhaps it only wishes to complete itself. If anyone reads this, don't look for me, and don't mirror the text." The log ends abruptly. The final file on his hard drive is an image of his empty office, timestamped 2017 AM 5. The continuing pattern today. The Verin pattern exists only in scattered rumor and metadata anomalies. Academic institutions deny its presence. Yet archivists still speak, in quiet tones, of the mirror glitch, moments when a scanned page duplicates itself reversed, or a transcript repeats a line backward, even on offline systems. In 2024, during a routine update to the British Library's digital catalogue, several entries briefly changed author attribution to R. Holt, Merrin D. Haldane D.A. Verin. The names disappeared moments later, and on rare occasions, when the servers stall between maintenance cycles, workers claim to hear faint audio bleed through the system's white noise. A woman's voice reading names. Then a second voice echoing them in reverse, always ending with the same phrase, "It remembers those who remember it." 6. Closing the record. This document, assembled from cross-referenced materials and interviews between 2020 and 2025, constitutes the final composite known as the Verin Pattern Archive. Its sources span nearly 2 centuries of observation, beginning with the first mirror anomalies at Verin Hall in 1834, and concluding with the present digital echoes. No single theory explains the phenomenon. Some scholars interpret it as a form of inherited psychosis, transmitted culturally rather than genetically, a meme in the truest, most parasitic sense. Others regard it as evidence of non-human cognition, a structure born of human attempts to measure perception itself. The one consensus among surviving researchers is that attempts to suppress the pattern only strengthen its hold. Each retelling, each transcription, ensures continuation. Destruction is meaningless where memory itself is the vessel. 7. The last reflection. If you have read this far, you are now part of its archive. The pattern extends through attention. Its geometry forms only when observed. The mirrored phrasing, the repetition of 2017. These are not superstitions but coordinates. The archive is not a place but a process. And somewhere, at the edge of the visible spectrum, it is watching to see if you will remember. Do not look for it. Do not try to trace the names. The moment you do, the reflection will begin again, because that is how all archives live, not in preservation, but in the persistence of recognition. And now, it recognizes you. A whispered, almost indistinguishable in the static, remembered